The ancients were aware of the crack in space through which such an invasion could pour in. The breach has been made by nuclear activity that has disturbed the balance of the ions. If people think that UFOs and aliens are modern phenomena, then they usually think that it all began in the 1940s. They tend to think about the Roswell incident. They think about Area 51, military sightings, and also radar anomalies. And then they think about government secrecy and government cover-ups and also conspiracy theories. Weirdly, most people just accept this narrative that extraterrestrials just suddenly entered into our human awareness, but only in the 20th century. And these people tend to forget about the thousands upon thousands of years that preceded the 20th century. Now, long before modern events such as the Roswell event and also other famous incidents, occultists of all ages, all races and nations were already describing various non-human intelligences. And interestingly, many of these descriptions clearly resembled aliens and also UFOs. And if we go back even further, ancient texts like the Bhagavad Gita describes these aerial vehicles and wars, luminous beings, and these gods who are descending from the sky. So nothing about that account sounds like ancient, non-existent technology to me. Now, the idea of human intelligences interacting with non-human intelligences is clearly not new. It is ancient and can be found in many different ancient descriptions and also texts. But if we look beyond the myth and the scripture, certain occultists themselves treated this as something of exceptional importance for the human race. And some of these people were figures like Aleister Crowley and especially Kenneth Grant, whose work I am currently busy exploring in a series. Now, they never reduced these beings to what they were not. They actually worked with them meticulously so, and in so doing, they worked with them in rituals. Then they received and documented transmissions that they received in these rituals, and also the various different systems of making contact with these beings. Kenneth Grant is the author of Night Side of Eden and also of Outside the Circles of Time, and these two books form part of his Typhonian trilogy, which consists of 9 books. And in a sense, these expanded on the work of Crowley. And this is also very interesting because Kenneth Grant was actually an initiate of Aleister Crowley, and he often argued that these intelligences were absolutely definitely not symbolic archetypes. Specifically, he said that they were indeed non-human and also pre-human in some cases, and also that these beings exist outside of the normal spectrum of our terrestrial time and terrestrial evolution, and also sometimes outside of the very circles of time as we define it, because they don't prescribe to our laws or our time or even to our physics. They are in a completely different dimension, pun intended. So now, before we get even further into Crowley and the famous contact that he made, I want to quickly touch on something that both Crowley and Kenneth Grant speculated about. And that something is technology, or more specifically, the misuse of technology. Now, both of these famous occultists suggested that technological disturbances, especially atomic detonation, will affect many things. It will affect what Grant himself called the subtle strata of the atmosphere itself. And so when we look at this, then the idea is actually very simple. The idea is that our reality is layered. It's layered physically and then also energetically. And when we decide to tamper with it, and when we decide to split the atom or to detonate nuclear devices, then we are not only altering matter, but actually disturbing the ionosphere. You are not just disturbing the ionosphere, but you are also disturbing atmospheric equilibrium, which then technically means that you are now destabilizing the subtle layers that normally remain sealed. So this is a very important point to keep in mind. Grant then suggests that these disturbances will thin the boundaries between our realm and other realms, and the thinning of these boundaries will then open what we call gateways through which other beings can pass through. Now, these gateways are not necessarily literal holes in the sky, but rather breaches between these different dimensions and also between these different zones of existence. So when you keep this in mind, it becomes extremely relevant because, well, when you consider the massive increase in our UFO sightings in our modern era, after the development and then also the testing of atomic weapons, then it makes a lot of sense. So let me read a quote from Night Side of Eden that discusses this. And I'm old school, so I'm reading out of a book. The ancients were aware of the crack in space through which such an invasion could pour in. Now, this is really interesting because this tells me two things. Firstly, the ancients somehow knew there was a crack in space. How did they know that? Think back to tales such as the Bhagavad Gita, such as the Sumerian mythology, Egyptian mythology, and so on and so forth. But this also means that these ancients knew that there were other species in, let's just say, in the universe, and that they have the ability to enter our planet through this crack in space. And then it goes on. The breach has been made by nuclear activity that has disturbed the balance of the ions, and unless the correct keys are applied, the circle of human consciousness will be invaded by powers from the other side. And then it continues. And more than one great mystery school was foisted as the point of entry. The myth of the old ones returning to reclaim the thrones of earth is a very ancient theme. And the personal note I made here in my personal note book was, how does this statement relate to the modern day phrase extraterrestrials? And then I made a couple more notes here. God returning, the gods returning, an apocalypse, Ragnarok, the old ones from Lovecraft returning, and so on and so forth. Oh, and here it continues. The thrones of earth is a very ancient theme, and then it just goes on and on and on. Revised in recent decades. It goes on and on and on. Not only by fictional writings of such natural sensitives as Arthur Machen, H.P. Lovecraft, but also by physicists who are aware of the occult implications revealed by nuclear and subnuclear research. And it is only now that certain ancient occult traditions, especially those concerning the Tree of Life, may be read otherwise than a superstitious dread of evil spirits. Wow. It still goes on and on and on, but I'll leave this for another video. For now, let's step back into Grant's larger cosmology. In Kenneth Grant's work, especially in his Night Side of Eden, he describes something really interesting that is called the mouth zone. So, what is the mouth zone? We'll get to that in a moment. Remember that the whole idea with his Night Side of Eden was how to actually travel to Universe B, which is this other place. And then while you are there, communicate with beings in that universe by using the Tree of Death that he called the Night Side, while we are still living here on Earth, on this universe, Universe A. Now, his ideas are all sexual of nature, and all of them are deeply rooted in the feminine and the feminine power. Okay, so what is the mouth zone? The mouth zone, as mentioned by Kenneth Grant, is not just some fancy word. It's an actual thing, sort of. It is a liminal contact field. That is a zone, and that zone exists between the human perceptual spectrum and then all the other layers of consciousness, or all the other layers of whatever we call reality. Now, Kenneth Grant also associates the mouth zone with specific color frequencies, especially mauve or ultraviolet tones. because these are not just colors, these are colors that sit just beyond ordinary human visibility. So they are very significant in that sense, because the whole point here is simply spectrum and nothing else. So just as infrared and also ultraviolet exist beyond our normal human sight, Kenneth Grant suggests that there are bands of reality, and these also exist beyond our normal cognition, and in a sense, beyond normal human sight, because we can't always see these different realities. So, what is the famous saying? Out of sight, out of mind? In this case, this is definitely very fitting. So the mouth zone is such a band because it is a contact field and also a transitional layer, and also a zone where non-human intelligences can intersect and interact with human consciousness. Grant goes much deeper, obviously, and he also discusses what he calls the tunnels of Set, mentioned in Night Side of Eden. These are corridors rather than just stable realms, because they aren't stable. So check out my video titled Tunnels of Set, Kenneth Grant and the OTO. And while you're at it, also check out my Night Side series that covers various parts of this book. This is a very interesting, insightful book. It cannot even be described properly or summarized because it just won't do it justice. Please, guys, just read it. Now, each tunnel of Set is associated with a particular force, and then in some cases also with specific intelligences. Now, these specific intelligences are not always presented as human-like gods. They are also not our definition of angels, so they aren't angels in the traditional sense at all. And I would say they are not even demons in the traditional sense. They are configurations of consciousness, and these configurations do not conform to our human structures. These configurations or beings surpass our understanding, and yet people have been trying to describe them since the dawn of time. I mean, look at me. I am trying to describe them at this moment. Now, some of these beings are described in ways that very explicitly state that they have an anti-human form. But don't get hung up on those details yet, because the important point here is that Grant is actually mapping a system of contact with various extraterrestrial intelligences. A system that works. This man actually created a whole entire framework through which non-terrestrial, non-human intelligences can interact and communicate with us humans, but it has to happen under the right set of circumstances. In order to paint the perfect picture, we have to move on to Aleister Crowley. In 1918, Aleister Crowley produced a drawing drawing of an entity that he called Lamb. Now, Lamb is depicted with an enlarged head, a very thin body, extremely big eyes, and basically all of his features strikingly resemble a grey alien in our modern culture. But this drawing was produced in 1918. Now, Crowley then claimed that this entity, Lamb, was a transmitter, a transmitted intelligence rather, that he was a being that he contacted through very intense, persistent ritual practices over a long period of time. And then, yes, Crowley's earlier major contact before Lamb, where he received the Book of the Law, took place in Egypt, actually, in 1904, during his honeymoon with Rose Kelly. And this is also a very interesting, eye-opening encounter. Read up about it if you are not familiar with this. But in short, this contact in 1904 introduced a being called Aiwass, whom Crowley then described not as a god in the typical sense, but as a praetor human intelligence. Okay, so a praetor human intelligence. Well, I don't know about you, but what does this even mean? Well, firstly, definitely not human. Um, I wouldn't say divine. So whatever the exact meaning may be, let's just say that this was something that just wasn't human, did not resemble a human in any sense, and this something was very different and something that we cannot actually define, and maybe we shouldn't. Lamb then appeared later as part of that broader current of the contact that Aleister Crowley had with Aiwass. Kenneth Grant took Crowley's accounts of Lamb very seriously, also his accounts of Aiwass. And remember that Kenneth Grant later elaborated on a lot of Crowley's work. To Kenneth Grant, Lamb was the ultimate proof needed that the occult tradition had already been in contact with what our modern society and culture then later interpreted as extraterrestrial intelligences or aliens or UFOs. When we add H.P. Lovecraft into this mixture of interesting characters, things begin to make a lot of sense. And you'll understand why in a moment. Now, H.P. Lovecraft was a very interesting character and a very good writer. He even wrote about these beings that emerge, quote, when the stars are aligned. He then goes much further and he actually describes entities and says that these entities are waiting beyond space and time and they are unable to fully enter into our dimension until certain cosmic conditions are met. In other words, when the stars are aligned. He then elaborates even more and he describes a devout cult group of these ancient beings or ancient ones that basically existed for thousands of years and that they still exist today. And their sole task on this planet is to do rituals that are aimed towards the earlier release of these ancient beings, who many people believe were actually the very first gods who somehow got entrapped by the later gods. Kenneth Grant firmly believed that H.P. Lovecraft was unconsciously tapping into the very same current as described in so many different occult traditions. And it makes a lot of sense because H.P. Lovecraft had horrible nightmares, and his nightmares actually inspired a lot of his writings. Now, when Lovecraft writes about, quote, alignment of stars, we can interpret this in many different ways, astronomically or symbolically or even energetically. He was purposefully very vague with this statement because one would naturally assume planetary alignment, but that is not necessarily the case. What if the term alignment here does not refer to planetary geometry at all? What if this refers to environmental and also atmospheric conditions, to only name a few? Obviously, there could be more. And then, what if a large scale technological disturbance, such as atomic detonations, causes an alteration in the ionosphere, and this alters the magnetic fields, which then alters atmospheric charge? Now, keep that in mind and then answer this question. What if those alterations create temporary alignments? So, what do I mean with temporary alignments? In other words, the quote, stars being aligned, or quote, the stars being right, could very well refer not only to celestial positioning, but to the actual conditions necessary that make dimensional thresholds permeable for things to pass through, for beings to come into our realm, and vice versa. I think this is a pretty solid theory. And this pretty much brings us full circle for today's video. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please subscribe, like, and comment. You can also follow me on Patreon. My link will be in the description and in the pinned comment. Until next time.